When you take a medication, you assume it will work the same every time. An entire industry is emerging to provide quality control for pharmaceuticals. In the US alone, the market is estimated to rise to $9.7 billion by 2027, according to Market Research Future. Valisure is an independent lab dedicated to batch testing medications before they reach consumers, ensuring therapeutic effectiveness, predictable performance, and safety. David, how did we end up in a place where a company like Valisure is solving such a huge problem that you wouldn't think, as an average consumer, even exists?
You know, it was surprising to me as well. And I think the big point is that everybody's assuming that a regulated product means that the regulators are out there testing everything. Right? They assume that the FDA has an FDA-approved drug product or an FDA-approved sunscreen, and that they're actually going and testing these
Certainly
products.
myself as a consumer, that's what I've always assumed.
Right, and the reality is that these agencies are there to inspect facilities, are there to inspect paperwork, but the actual testing of the products are almost entirely done by the manufacturers themselves and then self-reported to these agencies like the FDA. And that's good most of the time, but sometimes there's big cracks and things fall through those cracks, and that's what Valisure is identifying to really be an independent layer of quality assurance.
How do you think that those cracks develop in what are otherwise very solid manufacturing processes that these big companies are running?
Well, I think it's really the fact that there's a lack of this independent quality assurance. And this is something that exists in almost every other consumer industry. You buy a used car, you look at a Carfax report, or you look at what J.D. Power and Associates said about it independently. Anything you buy online, on Amazon, you look at the reviews. But where are the reviews, this kind of independent review for pharmaceutical products? And I think the fact that that's been missing for decades is how these cracks have gotten bigger and more is falling through them.
And so Valisure is the solution that is agnostic to any of the manufacturers and is really an independent third-party validation layer.
We're an entirely science-based organization. That's exactly correct. We're a third party. We are an independent private laboratory, and we really feel that that's super important for the entire industry.
What are the obvious benefits that have already been realized by having your presence in the marketplace?
So first of all, what's been quite visible is recalls of affected products. We've been extremely effective at identifying really global issues with pharmaceutical quality. Drug products like Zantac are all ranitidine products, which are the generic versions, were withdrawn all over the world because we tested it actually on an infant syrup formula that was prescribed to one of our co-founders' infant daughter. And we found that it had fundamental instability problems. It was forming what is a probable human carcinogen, an incredibly potent one.
Being benzene.
And that one was actually nitrosodimethylamine.
Even worse, perhaps.
And it's actually used to induce cancer in rats in clinical studies. So that you can often hear about, but honestly, one of the things that makes me the most excited is seeing how health systems, purchasers of drugs, have been getting more and more engaged in actually utilizing our services, utilizing independent certification on their own products. We're working with manufacturers, with purchasers. We look at raw materials, sometimes with consumer products.
As inputs.
Right. I mean, something like a benzene contamination, nobody wants that. Many companies went out and said, we didn't purposely put that in there. It's not an ingredient. But the point is that they were there, often from the raw materials all the way to the beginning of the supply chain. Supply chain is incredibly complex. We're hearing that more and more as consumers about supply chain problems. But this is an issue that manufacturers have had to deal with always. And it's only getting more and more complicated, more and more global.
And one of the things that I think is most interesting about Valisure is you've successfully positioned yourself as an ally of the manufacturer, helping to improve the outcomes of product.
We see ourselves as exactly assisting the entire healthcare ecosystem, the entire healthcare supply chain. And we started it with our own pharmacy, right? So we had a laboratory, we had a pharmacy that we attached to it. So we were dispensing independently certified medications and consumer products. But that's really being at the end of the supply chain. How much better to work throughout the supply chain so we can catch a problem before it ends up on the shelf and add that transparency and additional quality assurance.
The percentages around the levels of contamination are pretty surprising as well. You'd think with how robust these manufacturers are and how widely deployed they are, what do you think is leading to still these high levels of contamination that you're finding?
So I think it's not only important to have this independent testing, but also that it's being done in the industry.
Right.
You know, if you look at something like ranitidine products, there was over 400 academic studies that talked about ranitidine and the probable carcinogen NDMA before we came out with our study. But that's in the academic world, right? Not in, unfortunately, in the industry world. So I think it's really important that we take this academic lens to quality and apply it broadly in the actual industry.